Hi, it's Jeremy Faust, editor-in-chief of MedPage Today. I'm glad to be joined today by Dr. Scott Leibowitz, who is a child and adolescent psychiatrist internationally known for specializing in the care of transgender and gender-diverse children and adolescents. Dr. Leibowitz serves on the board of directors for the World Professional Association for Transgender Health and has been a co-investigator on federally funded research on this topic. Dr. Scott Leibowitz, thank you so much for joining us here on MedPage Today.
Thank you for having me.
Depending on what nook of the internet you might live on, you might have a very narrow view of this topic, but you've really seen something much broader than that in your 17 years in this experience. For people who maybe live in one echo chamber or another, can you just bring it all together and tell everyone the nuances and various aspects of this field?
Well, thank you for asking that question. It's a very difficult time these days, considering the politicization of an issue that's actually pretty complex. And I think it's important that we all start with the idea that being transgender in and of itself is a valid experience that people have. And while young people may be exploring their identities, and it's important for us to be thinking about how they are making decisions in the context of their development, it's also important to realize that uh, people need access to care that is very much life improving and does have an evolving evidence base. So what I would say is that we have standard of care that help us provide a set of important and conservative guardrails that help physicians and providers be able to navigate the complexity of the care, and we can do so in an ethical way.
There's a sense that in some corners that the guardrails aren't enough, but that's not your experience, correct?
My experience is when we follow the guardrails and when we have resources that allow us to follow those guardrails, so trained mental health professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, other master's levels mental health professionals, we can really understand each young person's experience and what goes into their need for a particular treatment. So while some say their guardrails are not enough, I would argue that that's not true. We do have sufficient guardrails in place.
And I also want to talk about the recent environment that this field is facing, which is that there are now bans. I mean, before this was just happening, and it was a growing field, and there was evidence collection and study, and it was just sort of happening organically, and just the way every other field sort of develops in a way. And then you had something that we would never imagine in diabetes care, banning a certain treatment or a therapy based on politics. But and I think there's a sense that some would say, okay, it's putting the brakes on. What's the problem with a ban? You could always resume. Tell us why a ban can actually be harmful immediately.
I'll actually start before the ban. Even the threat of a ban, in and of itself,
Mhm.
really creates significant challenges in the clinical treatment frame. When parents and young people are afraid that their care might be threatened or that a ban might go through, as something that I saw for well over 2 years practicing in that environment before any ban even passed, the impact that that has on their own decision making is something that we have to take into account when we're working through those decisions with families. So it's every single appointment, there's going to be an incredible and unnecessary amount of extra time devoted to discussions around the politics and what people are going through, whether they should move to a different state, whether they should keep one kid in their family in one state and bring the other kid to a different state. These are all unnecessary extra issues that people have to deal with before a ban even goes into effect. Then, once a ban goes into effect, certainly we can see the harms of not being able to access care that some youth do benefit from. And that's a problem. And when we have bans in effect, then it actually prevents us from being able to collect evidence that we need to collect. So, any concerns about evidence uh, that seem to be met with a ban seems to be incongruent in my mind.
And in your MedPage editorial, I just remember in rereading it, remember this part about this idea that really riffs on what you just said, which is that bans actually have a way of actually making the decision making more difficult. If anyone were out there worrying that people are rushing to something that they will regret later, you're saying actually the threat of a ban would be pushing people to make decisions, whether they're the right ones for them or not. But I think I think the evidence suggests that most of these cases are usually pretty well, worked out, and people are happy with their outcomes. You're saying that even the threat of a ban can actually really do the opposite of what someone who, for whatever reason, is critical of this care would want, which is to say that it hastens the conversation. Now, again, I really think that all the evidence that I've ever seen would not suggest this sort of fever dream that there's all this regret. But for anyone who did have that idea, this specter you're arguing actually makes that worse.
I absolutely would agree that that does make that worse. It could do one of many things. It could hasten someone's need to or sense of urgency to get a treatment, or it could also delay that urgency. It would
Hmm.
cause someone to say, you know what, I'm afraid that my care will be taken away if I were to start it, so I'm not going to start it, and then they suffer needlessly. So it could do more than one thing, and it's all iatrogenic in quotes.
Yeah.
What I would say also, though, is when it comes to regret, if regret were the true arbiter of whether or not we should provide care, then a lot of other care should be banned. And
Mm.
we don't apply that. There's a double standard that's applied to transgender care, particularly with minors. Regret in and of itself is a very complex concept. There's outcome regret and there's decisional regret. And if we approach the care by following the standard of care and doing a proper job evaluating each young person's psychological, mental health, and psychological well being and what goes into their decision making, then we can, in fact, truly minimize decisional regret. We'll never be able to fully minimize outcome regret, but that's just the same thing in the rest of medicine.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the things that I think is so interesting about this moment is that there are a lot of really important studies that have been underway looking at how this is going and how this is playing out and what are best practices. And the Trump administration's approach to this topic, not exactly enlightened in the sense that it's saying we know the answers and you're not allowed to study this. So what do you think is going to be lost by the fact that top of the list for grants to be axed is this exact kind of work?
It's truly a travesty what is happening. It's a massive attack on evidence-based care and science right now. Longitudinal data, which is something that everybody's been calling for, something that many of these clinics that are in existence received funding to obtain. All of that is being stopped dead in its tracks. And so we're losing out on very valuable scientific advancement when it comes to understanding best practices and outcomes for trans and gender diverse young people. I would also say that in no other area of medicine do we use one person's negative experience to care as a reason to ban care for everybody.
Hmm.
Absolutely, there are young people that may have regretted their care. That's absolutely true. But then we want to look and understand what is it about their experience that led them to feel that way? What did or did not happen at the time they made their original decision? And these are situations that we can mitigate, and these are about best practices and helping put up those guardrails to guide clinicians to doing this care ethically.